Well, as others start trickling in, I'll get started with some of the housekeeping items that we have, and then we can kind of dive in a little bit further. So hi, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of Elevation's virtual conference, EL Impact. We're so excited to have you, and some of you may have joined yesterday, so welcome back if that's true. Otherwise, we hope you check out the recordings if you weren't able to make it yesterday. We're really excited to have this first session this morning, a principled approach to teaching ELs in the distance learning era. We've got 2 wonderful speakers here to share, and cannot wait for you to learn so much from them. Their presentation looks amazing. But again, before we get started, so I mentioned all of your cameras and mics will be off for this session automatically. Down at the bottom, you have 2 options, a chat option and a Q&A option. So the chat's on the left, and that's where we'd love to see general chatter as you're doing right now, introducing yourselves, maybe throwing out when you love to hear something, when something really resonates with you, or if you have general feedback or advice for each other as you go back and forth. But any questions you have for the speakers or anything you need directly answered from someone from Elevation, please feel free to throw that in the Q&A so that myself or one of my colleagues will be able to answer that for you. And then we can also front load those questions for you all during that Q&A session at the end. If you do want to speak at the end and you have a question that you'd like to speak, you can raise your hand. There's that functionality within Zoom as well. But if you raise your hand throughout, we won't get to your question until the very end. So you might as well just drop it in the box so that you don't forget it, or so that we are sure to make sure that we get to it as well. Other than that, we are excited to have you all here. If you're moved to share, please do follow us on Twitter, on Instagram at Elevation Ed, on Facebook, Elevation Education. Feel free to tweet, retweet, send some things out about what your experience is today. We're excited to have you all. We're excited to get started. And without further ado, I'll introduce our president and co-founder, Teddy Rice, who will share a little bit more about our speakers.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us on the second day of our EL Impact Conference. For those of you who were able to see some of the sessions yesterday, I think it was I thought it went really well, and it was a fabulous opportunity to sustain some of the ongoing learning that we all missed during this COVID time. I'm really happy to welcome and introduce our 2 speakers today, Drs. Karen Gregory and Gretchen Oliver. Both from upstate New York. They are professors at Clarkson University, which I understand has a couple campuses, and you guys are in the Albany Center. Dr. Gregory is the director of TESOL programs at Clarkson. Gretchen is the assistant director. And in addition to their many accolades as French and Spanish teachers and practitioners and professors, they are also newly minted podcast celebrities on the Highest Aspirations podcast at Elevation, which is actually one of our most popular podcasts we've ever had, in part because of their expertise on the topic they're about to get into today, distance learning for English learners, how we can use technology to connect with students during this really difficult time. And we're all obviously highly attuned to that challenge and looking for expertise and support from folks like Drs. Gregory and Oliver, and I'll let them kind of run with the presentation and look forward to hearing some questions along the way. I might add occasional color commentary here and there, but we'll step aside for them to spend another hour with us. So thanks so much, and turn it over to you guys.
Thank you so much, Teddy. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll go ahead and get started. So, make sure I'm doing this right. Oh, there we go. Okay. So this is our presentation, a principled approach to teaching ELLs in the distance learning era. And we'd like to go ahead and let me see if I can advance here. tell you a little bit about us. The first thing I want you to note here is that we've included our Twitter handles here. So if you'd like to follow us or tweet at us or tweet about our presentation, we want to make this as interactive as possible. And we're going to be talking about different modes of communication, those being interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational. And so we want to encourage all of you to engage in these different modes of communication as we go through. So Karen, why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit about who we are.
Okay, well, so my name is Karen Gregory, and I'm the Director of TESOL programs at Clarkson University, and I'm an assistant professor here. And oh, sorry, if you hear my tweeting, I have my phone is going off. So thank you for those people who just started following. So I'm at Clarkson University. As Teddy said, we're in Schenectady, New York, actually, in the capital region. And Gretchen and I met actually as graduate students at the university at Albany and have been collaborating ever since then. Gretchen, you want to introduce yourself?
I do, and sadly, I advanced the slideshow and I can't get it back. But as Karen said, we did meet as doctoral students at the University of Albany a few years ago. And I think that we were just destined to get together and work together because we're very like-minded. We are really grounded in the practitioner piece of language specialists. And we were both foreign language teachers and taught English abroad before we got into the TESOL world. And now we are running a program at Clarkson University that prepares both in-service and pre-service teachers to teach English language learners in New York State. And we're going to be sharing some anecdotes from our learning, working with these folks, as well as some things that we've gleaned from working with teachers in professional development settings. So Karen, do you want to go ahead and give a little bit of an overview here?
Sure. So when COVID first started, when the schools started first shutting down in March, and we just felt like everybody was just getting bombarded with technology and lists of websites and all kinds of PD opportunities. And Gretchen and I both, I think, felt because we have a cohort of graduate students that we're working with who are student teachers, and we have our alums who are in schools who are constantly talking to us also, everybody's heads were just spinning, and we just wanted to say, like, hold the phone, everybody stop, and let's just catch our breath. And that's kind of what our first podcast was about in March when we talked to Steve. And so these ideas kind of come from that idea of let's just take a pause and look at what we already know and then move forward from there.
And I'm not really sure. There we go.
Thank you. So just quickly, this is kind of an outline of what we are going to be talking about. We're going to define for you what we're talking about when we say distance learning. And then we're going to give a brief theoretical foundation talking about theories of learning, theories of language learning, theories of the learner, theories of teaching. But we're going to go quickly through that so that we can get to what we're really talking about, which is a principled approach. And how do we use what we know? How do we use these big building blocks about teaching and learning to guide us in this technological world and in this distance learning environment?
And so for those of you that are familiar with the Highest Aspirations podcast, you know one of Steve's questions at the end is to share a resource that's been influential to the speakers in their professional lives. And one of those resources for both myself and Karen has been the book by Margaret Heritage, Aida Walke, and Robert Linquati, English Language Learners and the New Standards. And so many of the ideas that we are going to be sharing here today really build from what they've set forth in this book, looking at shifts in pedagogy, looking at using theory to guide your practice, and the role that assessment plays in planning and teaching and learning, and then of course policy. So we want to just recognize the work that they have done and let you know that we're going to be building on these foundational ideas and applying them to this distance learning context.
Okay, so to get started here, when we hear the term distance learning, or when we think of distance learning, we might be thinking of that picture of the student at home in front of his laptop. But really, the environment that we're in today is totally unique and new and different than anything we've ever done before, and it's all distant learning. So we've got, if you have students who are in a classroom, they most likely look like that picture there. Students are socially distanced. They are at least 6 feet apart. In our schools anyway, the kids need to wear masks all day long. The teachers wear masks all day long. So facial expressions are hidden. Then we've got remote instruction, which is kids learning from home. They're online and they are connected via teleconferencing, Google Hangouts, or whatever it might be. And then we've got the totally bonkers situation of hybrid, where teachers are teaching one group online and one group in front of them in the classroom at the same time. So they're going back and forth. And we have that in our schools locally here. So we are very familiar with teachers trying to do their best with both kids at home online and kids in front of them in the classroom at the same time. So it's definitely really complex and really different than anything we've ever done. And no matter which way you're teaching, it's really a new kind of distance learning. So we're going to, as I said, kind of give you some big building blocks first before we dive into what's really the nuts and bolts of this presentation. So we're thinking of like big umbrellas. And the biggest umbrella of language learning are these pieces here. So we've got these theories of learning, sociocultural theory of learning, where we're talking about students learning through interaction, scaffolding, the zone of proximal development. We're talking about constructivism, the idea that we're going to build content or build conceptual understanding from the bottom up through inquiry. We have the ideas of Bloom's taxonomy and Webb's depth of knowledge, which have to do with getting students to the highest levels of thinking, higher order thinking, such as creating their own materials and applying, synthesizing. And this usually goes hand in hand with creating rigorous instruction. And then there's also Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where we are considering the physiological needs of students, and we're thinking about social emotional learning. So all of these are kind of the big foundational pieces to what we're doing in the classroom and what we're thinking about as teachers when we're planning our instruction, whether it be face-to-face or in a remote setting.
And then starting to zero in a little bit, we're talking about English learners here, and we're talking about students who are expected to learn English as a new language while they're learning grade level content. And so the theories that guide us in that approach to language learning are also important to recognize. We've kind of parsed these out into 3 buckets here. We have this first idea that language learning is an individual or cognitive endeavor, where it belongs to the student. And so in this type of environment, we might see more of a direct instruction where teachers engage in more monologic types of classroom instruction, where they engage in initiation, response, evaluation types of questioning and classroom dialogue. From there, we have this other bucket where language learning is the result of interaction, modified input, and opportunities for output. And with this, it's almost like like a computer model. You know, I'm an individual, I put something in, I get something out, I regulate myself based on what I'm receiving here. Not completely social, but there is this need to have the other there. And then the third bucket is this idea that language learning is collaborative and it's a social endeavor. And this is where we really want to hone in on what are the things that we are doing as instructors to promote dialogue and make our instruction dialogic in nature, so that students can interact with one another and build on one another's ideas. We often ask our graduate students to watch videos of language instruction in content area classrooms and identify things that are behaviorist in nature or innatist in nature or interactionist in nature. And then we ask them to try to apply that to their practice. So what is it that you can do to support this interaction that is so necessary for students to develop their conceptual understandings and develop their language simultaneously? And are we seeing too much of that behaviorist? You know, is language learning, is learning in general just you know, for reward or for punishment? And so having this awareness, we think, is really important for both pre-service and in-service teachers as they're designing instruction to make it accessible and meaningful for their learners. Okay, this is me. I'm going to keep going. Likewise, it's important. We need to think about, how do we think about our learners? That plays a really important role in how we approach planning instruction and assessment. And so are we viewing our learners, our English learners, with an assets-based view? Do we see them as having agency and as being capable? Do we hold them to high expectations? And do we value their lived experiences and home languages and cultures? On the other end, Karen, why don't you talk about the deficit-based perspective?
So the deficit-based perspective, I think, is always, first of all, I would say that it is kind of what's with English language learners. Sometimes it's what is most apparent. And so the job of the ENL teacher is to find those assets and to bring those out, because otherwise all we'll see are these deficits. The assessments that we do at state level and sometimes the national level, they're intended to find these gaps or to find these deficits. And sometimes with English language learners, we think, well, yeah, of course, we knew that. That was an obviously. So finding the strengths is really going to be such an important role of ENL teachers, especially in this distance setting, where teachers, the classroom teachers, the content area teachers may not know their students as well as they would in a more typical school year. So in this deficit-based view of students, students are seen as blank slates or empty vessels to be filled with knowledge. And a lot of these instructional technologies, that's what they're doing. They're just trying to fill students with all this information, but there's no deep synthesis or learning going on. It involves, when we think of a deficit-based view, students need certain prerequisites to be able to engage with content. So this is when you hear teachers saying, well, shouldn't they just learn English completely first, and then we can teach them math, and then we can teach them science? And no, of course not. We can do this. We can do both at the same time. And the idea that ELLs need simplified language and content, we do need to scaffold, of course, but they can do it, and we know they can do it. And as ENL teachers, that's going to be our job, is to help everybody in the school community to realize that they can do it. Yes, these deficits exist, but that's just one small piece of the puzzle. Let's look at their strengths and build on their strengths so that we can bring them into the classroom community and provide access to everything that all students have.
Hey, Karen or Gretchen, at the risk of betraying some ignorance, I have a quick question or clarification. So when we had, you guys used the phrase dialogic in the slide prior, and Dr. Tim Bowles yesterday made a point of really using that phrase as well. And I hadn't heard that used as frequently. Certainly clarifying input, fortifying output, productive domains, receptive domains, all of that for sure. But dialogic seems to be emerging as a new way of describing the kind of interactions we want kids to have. Is that true, or is there something about this environment that you think is giving new credence to that kind of way of describing what people should be aspiring for?
Karen, do you want to jump at that, or would you like me to?
So I think that, so Gretchen and I think we forgot to say that our program, our entire program, graduate program, is online. So we are very much immersed in the online learning world. And I think dialogic is a term that we hear a lot when we're talking about technologies and online learning and sociocultural theory and constructivism. All of that, I think, is connected to this idea of creating dialogue, both between teachers and students and students and students. Whereas you might think of what a kind of classic classroom looks like is monologic, a teacher talking. And I think one of the affordances of technology that people talk about is that, especially, like when, like way back a million years ago, they started talking about Web 2.0. The thing about it was that it was dialogic. It was, you could participate in it. It wasn't just, a one-way communication.
Right. Perfect, Karen. I don't even think I need to add anything. You're so good.
No, I really like the word, and it really it zeroes in, I think, on the environments we want to create. It just and there's a little chatter about some people hadn't heard of it, some people had. I just wanted to surface it as one that seems to be rising to the front. Anyway.
Well, and I think it really does, highlight the importance of that student-centered learning environment where students have opportunities to play with language and experiment, and it doesn't have to be perfect, right? They can get to that academic language where they attach these concepts to, but they do it through dialogue. We know that, the natural progression, you don't start by writing, you start by speaking, and you work through your ideas through oral language first. And so we want to create those spaces where dialogue is valued, because it does get us to where we want to get our students. Okay, so just to finish up with this whole idea of theory, and we really did not want to go down a rabbit hole here, but we just wanted to kind of highlight some of what we know, what's important, what is the knowledge base for teaching. And for those of you who are teaching right now, I can't see a raise of hands, but I just want you to reflect. How many of you at one point have thought to yourself or said out loud, oh my goodness, I feel like a first-year teacher this year? Right? We've heard it left and right. Okay, so these ideas of content knowledge and pedagogical knowledge and curriculum knowledge and the whole list here, these things have changed with this shift to distance learning, because it's not just knowing how to teach the way that you've always taught. It's knowing how to teach in these new your content in these new distance learning environments, and making your content accessible to learners in distance learning and helping them to develop the digital literacy skills that they need in order to be successful. We also see that teachers might not be able to get to know students the way that they have traditionally in face-to-face regular classrooms because they're at a distance. And so it might be harder to get at who their students are and what their contexts are and where they're learning and how they're learning. Likewise, I wonder, have our educational ends and purposes and values somewhat shifted here in this distance learning era? So what are our goals? Are they still to teach to that test? Are they still to, what are they here? And so we need to kind of take a step back and look at these 7 elements of the knowledge base for teaching and take a minute to kind of reevaluate and think about how is it that we can support teachers in making sure that they have all of these skills and understandings in order to be able to really truly meet their ELLs where they are in distance learning environments. So I'd like to end this little section here about theory with a quote from Heritage and her colleagues. The idea that teachers receive too much strategy training with little or no reflection of reasons, purposes, moments, and places in lessons where those strategies may be productive. To us, this quote really hit home because at the onset of the pandemic and the shift to remote learning, we were getting tools, and strategies. And really, teachers were not given the time and the space to take a step back and think about, okay, well, how does this align to my pedagogical practices and my philosophy and where I'm comfortable? And we really need to think about how we can ground our practice and employ what Schulman calls pedagogical reasoning. And this involves comprehension, so really understanding our content, transformation, being able to transform it into ways that it's accessible to our students, instruction, and deliver it in ways that our students can engage with it, evaluation, so assess where our students are, what they've gotten, what they still might need, and then reflection, and what does it need for our practice in the larger picture.
Okay, so this brings us to the main ideas that we wanted to share with you today, which are about principles and practice. So how can we take what we've been talking about and think about the principles that we all have and things that we know and put them together with all the new technologies that are out there so that we can kind of quiet all the noise a little bit for ourselves and just like be very principled about what we're choosing, why we're choosing it, and planning with a goal in mind. So we are talking about starting with the goal and then finding the tech tool that meets that purpose. And again, as we said earlier, we started thinking about this when the schools started moving to remote settings, and this is what we talked about in our podcasts. And the idea is that we're going to kind of put the brakes on a little bit with all the lists and all the information that's coming at us from all sides, and just think about why are we doing this? Where are we going? What is our end goal? And now what can I put in place to get my kids to that end goal? That's what we're going to be talking to you about in this next section. Okay, so we're going to start with the 3 modes of communication. And this is a framework that is readily used in the world language world, and I think also in TESOL, but maybe not as much. And so this idea that there are 3 different types of communication, interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational, makes it, again, like kind of quieting the noise, and we can think about three buckets or 3 goals that we have for our students. We want them to be able to interpret information, we want them to be able to talk about it, and we want them to be able to create show their understanding in unique and creative ways. So we're going to go through each of these modes of communication and talk a little bit about what is out there and how we can plan instruction, thinking about these 3 modes of communication as a way to guide us.
And Karen, can I just add here before we get into that first mode that we want to think about how we can bring our academic content into the framework of these 3 modes so that we can get our students so that they are speaking and listening and reading and writing all in an integrated way. When we look at our state and national standards and the disciplinary practices that are associated with these standards, we're asking students to interpret and analyze and synthesize and create, and all of those are higher order. So we want to move beyond that simple recall and summary. And through these different modes of communication, we really believe that teachers are poised to be able to position their students to be able to do that.
And I'm sorry, one last thing about this, and then we'll get into it. We started with those big kind of building blocks. And just to connect back to that, this is really, this focus on three modes of communication really is a practical application of sociocultural theory and constructivist learning theory, because we are asking students to talk to each other, work together, figure things out, and then present their ideas and their new understanding. So this is a way to get students thinking critically and to make sure that our instruction is, as Gretchen said, not low level, but high level and rigorous. Okay, so the first of these is interpretive communication. And so what we're talking about here is one-way communication. So I'm reading something, or I'm listening, or I'm viewing something, and I'm getting a message, and I'm understanding that message. So in that way, there's no negotiation of meaning. I can't ask my reading passage what they meant by that. I just have to take it in and do my best to interpret the message as it is presented to me. So in a typical classroom before, pre-pandemic, things that we would do to support interpretive communication, which involves reading, viewing, and listening. We might ask students to read and create storyboards, do character descriptions, do different jigsaw activities, reader response, different kinds of research. In terms of viewing, we might look at advertisements or films or shorts or documentaries, and then listening using music or speeches or poetry or announcements. So these are all things that we might do in a typical classroom where we're asking students to read something and understand it, view something, understand it, listen and understand it. Now the question to ask yourself is, can students do this even in a distance setting? Can they do all these things? And they can, for sure. We don't really need technology help with a lot of these things, or the technology that we were using before, we can continue to use. YouTube videos are great for viewing short films or documentaries or whatever you might have. But in addition to what we've already done, there are new online tools that exist that can support interpretive communication. So some examples, and these are, as Gretchen and I put this together, we said, we're not here to be like a commercial for all these different websites and apps and everything. And we don't know all of them by any means. We just, we know some of them and they've come our way. And so that's what we're going to share. So when it comes to reading or interactive reading, some that we've found that our teachers really use and have success with is News ELA, Reading A to Z, and Storyline Online. For viewing, YouTube, so again, we're interpreting messages, right? YouTube, Pear Deck, Edpuzzle is a great tool to help students interpret what they're listening to or viewing. And then in terms of online listening, there's the lyrics training website, YouTube, and then Google Classroom, to kind of store all of it as a place where you can put all your interpretational materials, ask students some questions to make sure that they are with you in their understanding. They're doing their reading comprehension or listening comprehension.
So I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about interpersonal communication. I have two little points to make before I talk about the characteristics of it. First of all, we see these three modes of communication going hand in hand with one another. First, students might be set out to interpret something individually or in a small group, and then we want to set them up where they engage in some type of interpersonal communication. So each mode is going to build on the one that came before it and then the one that it's going next to. And we're going to fluctuate back and forth. The other point that I'll make is that this interpersonal mode of communication is the one that we've found that that students and teachers alike have the hardest time with. And especially in distance learning environments, interpersonal communication is challenging. Why is that? Well, it does require a two-way negotiation of meaning. And so we have to have spaces, whether they're remote or socially distanced face-to-face or a combination thereof, where students can communicate and where they can communicate in spontaneous ways. We don't want them just scripting things, reading off of the script or writing something and sharing it. That's not necessarily interpersonal. We also want it to be meaningful for them. We want them to write and talk about something that's of interest to them because that's going to promote that engagement. Also, along with this mode of communication, this is where participants are able to observe one another and make adjustments or clarifications as needed. And that spontaneity is really important here. Challenging certainly is when you're in a face-to-face classroom and you're wearing a mask and you cannot read your partner's lips and make use of all of the linguistic resources that come with that. So just a point to bring up there. Interpersonal communication does take a couple of forms in terms of oral communication. It can be conversations and discussions, but also written, it can be letters, texts, emails, social media messages. And to bring back something that Teddy brought up earlier, this idea of the dialogic classroom, that's what we want to see with interpersonal communication. We want to see that dialogue, either written or spoken. So in a traditional classroom, reading and writing activities, again, could be text messages, emails, letters, social media messages, dialogue journals, either dialogue journals back and forth between students or between teachers and students. And then in terms of speaking and listening, conversations, dialogues, collaborative group tasks. So we want to keep though in mind that it's important to have that spontaneity and that ability to negotiate meaning, to clarify, ask questions, etc. Read body language. So as we said earlier, it is challenging in our distance learning environment. It is the most challenging that our students have faced, that the teachers that we've worked with have faced. But there are a variety of tools that can be used. I will say, in preparing this with Karen, we just keep going back to the idea that number one, it's very important to have clear and explicit directions and expectations for your students when you're going to set them up for this interpersonal communication. So they need to know what you want them to discuss and collaborate in. And so looking back at Tim Bowles' presentation from yesterday, those discourse moves are so important, right? We need to scaffold these discussions and these conversations for our ELLs, especially at our entering and emerging and transitioning levels where they have not yet met the linguistic demands of our grade level content. So those discourse moves are very important. But the other piece of it too is trust. We need to set norms, establish norms. We need to have our students be a part of those norms and buy into them and create spaces where we say to our students, we're going to trust that you're going to go and you're going to do what we've asked you to do. And these are the expectations. And we're going to come back together. We're going to, share out. But we have to be able to trust that our students are going to be able to do that. We find that this is a really powerful way to formatively assess where our students are with both conceptual understandings and language development when we're able to pop in to those breakout rooms and listen to the discussions, or when we're able to look at the chat back and forth in the Google Classroom, or we're able to look at the Google Doc that our students are working on together and see who's contributed what. We can really see where our students are and have our finger on the pulse of their learning. Sorry, my iPad just went blank and my notes are right there. That's my reaching. We also think that as we said, that this is challenging, it is really very important to give students the time and the space to be able to engage in this type of communication, to build their ideas before we set them off to do that next mode of communication, being presentational.
Gretchen, let me just pop in here real quick 1 second. Sure. So as you talked about trust, and that teachers really need to trust that their students will take advantage of the opportunity to speak to each other in a breakout room. I think, and we have talked about you have to set the norms. You have to, and that's what Gretchen was saying, you have to have a conversation with students and let them know, I trust you. I know you're going to do this. You're going to do a great job, and I'm going to come in and listen to you. But so many teachers that we've worked with, or our graduate students who are student teachers, they feel like they can't even take that step. So we'd encourage you to try to take that first step in there, because it is scary and you're not sure what's going to happen in that breakout room when you leave.
Hey, I'm curious if you guys, I think we should just sit here for a second, because I think this is just such an issue for everyone. And even as I've got 3 young school-age children, and anyone with kids kind of knows this firsthand at the moment. I'm curious if you guys have seen either any good practices or any sort of hacks, if I can use that phrase, around that building of trust, in particular as it relates to the parents or the caregivers at home. Are there ways to bring them into this so that you've got a little extra encouragement or support when you're trying to get that first grader or fourth grader to open up a little bit? And I'm curious if you've seen any success patterns there, or if that's been kind of outside the scope of a lot of your research.
Well, sorry, Gretchen, I know you were.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
You might be about to say the same thing. We have some teachers we've been talking to, and I'm thinking of one who told us that the whole family, not the whole family, but parents, younger siblings, everybody's gathered around the laptop and doing the lesson together. And that's okay. And that's perfectly fine. And in that way, the teacher is directly speaking to the adult who is present and maybe interacting with the younger siblings. So one of the things that teachers have said to us is that it's been great to be in kids' homes like that, and to they feel like they can connect with parents, and some parents or the adults are taking advantage of this to learn a little bit of English themselves.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'll draw from a secondary experience where one of our, she's actually an in-service teacher who is getting a second certification. She worked in a program over the summer with high school kids. And one of the things that she had her high school kids do was record their breakout session or their off, it wasn't even during the regular class. She said, here's your activity. Here's what you guys are going to have to go do together. Record it for me and share it with me. And I think that that's one of the affordances that we'll get into with this type of learning. You have more of a record here. This is something that a teacher can go back to and listen to or view and be able to see, where are they succeeding? Where are their challenges? What are those language moments that I now have a spotlight on that I can teach to? In terms of hacks, I think those are 2 little examples of how we can look at it from that glass is half full perspective of this is something that is actually going to help kids develop that interpersonal communication. Good. Okay, so we'll keep going here. Our third mode of communication is presentational communication. And I'll say this is often misinterpreted for interpersonal communication. We might say, okay, well, you're gonna work together, students, and the students might just write down everything, script it all out, and go back and forth. And that really is not interpersonal communication. That is presentational communication. It's one way, it's to an audience of readers or listeners or viewers. It's the presentation of information. It's not exchange. If you have a question, you can't raise your hand until that Q&A session, right? To get that clarification. So there's no negotiation of meaning. Likewise, what's important here is the presenter needs to have an understanding of the audience's language and culture to make sure that there's a successful interpretation of the ideas that they are sharing. And this can be an oral presentation of nature, so a story, a speech, a skit, maybe even a debate, an opening argument of a debate. When you go the back and forth, we get into that interpersonal, or it could be written, so a message, an article, a report, a story, or a script. So we've seen examples of this in traditional classrooms, writing examples we have here, and then speaking examples as well. But with our distance learning and our technology, there are some other tools that we can use to support this mode of communication. Screencasting is one. We at Clarkson use VoiceThread, but there are a number of other screencasting applications. And I would say for English learners, this is a real benefit for them because it's something that they can go back to. It's something that they can slow down. It's something that they can revisit as they need. So when we're presenting ideas and we're giving them the screencast, they can work with it at their level. And also it's multimodal in nature. So they're getting the information in an oral, in a visual way that is easier for them to comprehend. Video and audio recording apps, certainly Flipgrid and Extempore, Karen uses in her Spanish class. And then a third way to approach this is through storytelling. Two apps that I'm familiar with, Toontastic, and then podcasts. We all love podcasts, especially in the elevation community. But I will say one of the things that I recently heard was that one real benefit to this presentational mode of communication, when we give our students the ability to create stories and to do so in multimodal ways, we really are able to kind of get at what they're able to do, where they are in both conceptual understandings and language development. When we offer them the tools to draw from their own experiences and their interests, we're not only engaging them in some higher levels of thinking, but we're also providing them with opportunities to really tap into their prior experiences and really approach it from an assets perspective.
So we would, of course, be remiss if we did not talk about the challenges involved in all of this. Of course, we are all very much aware. Everyone who's in classrooms know that there are abundant challenges. So we will acknowledge those. So in terms of planning, there are overwhelming options, and that is kind of what is at the heart of this presentation. We are trying to make these overwhelming options a little bit more manageable by putting them in towards a goal. Putting them towards the goal that we want our students to get to. The challenge of collaboration with colleagues, I think, is amplified now that we're not all together and that maybe we're wearing masks, so we can't really see each other's facial expressions. So collaboration is definitely more challenging. Time has always been a challenge, and now it seems to be a bigger challenge than ever, because planning all of this, of course, takes a long time. Researching the tools, figuring out new ways of doing the things that you've done in the past. It all takes a lot of time. So for sure, that's a challenge. In terms of instruction, creating safe opportunities for interaction is definitely one of our challenges. We want students to be able to share and to be able to speak, and they have to feel safe in order to do that. So we have to find ways to create classroom environments that even if we're online, that are inviting and warm and friendly so that students can feel safe speaking. And we've actually heard from lots of our teachers that their ELLs are speaking a lot, that they're hearing from kids that they haven't heard from before because they do feel safe. Teaching new technology to our English learners or their adult helpers is a definite challenge that people are facing and confronting. The balance of screen time and thinking about how much screen time do we want our children to have and how can we reduce that. For these hybrid classes, being in 2 places at one time, that's crazy, but people are doing it and they are confronting that challenge with success. And then lastly here, in terms of instruction, this feeling of Zoom fatigue, and we probably have all felt this, that it's kind of exhausting. I had a teacher who explained it to me as, when I'm in the classroom, I feed off the energy of my students. And when I'm not personally with them, I don't get that. I don't have that. So I just get tired. So how to sustain our energy is definitely a challenge and something we need to think about. What personal strategies can we put into place so that it is all sustainable? And then lastly, in terms of assessment, trying to create authentic assessments and staying away from those tech tools that are very sparkly and shiny and very tempting, that can give us like a quick 10-question quiz on something, but it lacks any context to what we've been talking about. So trying to create authentic assessments, dealing with academic integrity online is really difficult, and figuring out how we can make sure that students are doing their own work and that what we're looking at is really theirs. And lastly, how to provide timely and meaningful feedback. Whereas in a classroom, maybe we're meeting for, for short conferences, how to do that in online settings might be a challenge that people are looking at.
So we also think that there are some opportunities that come with distance learning, and we want to build on the opportunities that present themselves, and hopefully consider them if and when we ever go back to normal, or whatever our next new normal is. In terms of planning, if you as a content teacher or classroom teacher need to prepare something ahead of time that you're going to push out to your student, this might provide for an opportunity to collaborate with your ESL or ENL specialists ahead of time. So this idea of being forced to plan ahead of time might open a door for some collaboration that you may not have had before. Likewise, since we're looking at different ways that we're planning and we're delivering instruction, we can think about different multimodal forms of scaffolding that will allow our ELLs to access the content and develop their English language proficiency simultaneously. And then another thing that it could be an opportunity is if we have a group of content teachers that come together and say, you know, why are we all doing the same thing? Why don't we divide and conquer? So we could have some collaborative planning among content teachers to prepare that content in advance so that we're not all doing the same thing. In terms of instruction, it depends on the district, it depends on the school. We may see that we have smaller in-person classes that are going to allow our students more individual attention. If we don't have the hybrid with the face-to-face and the remote students all together, this might be an opportunity to give that additional individual attention. When we're setting kids up with different technology tools like Flipgrid, where they're going to share something about themselves, they have the opportunity to wait and think, and then record, reflect, revise, and then submit. So we're building in these things that we know are really best practices that we might not actually have when we are live in the moment. Come on, we gotta go, we gotta go, we gotta go. We can also lower the affective filter in some cases. If we have students who are learning remotely and succeeding remotely, that maybe they weren't succeeding as well in that face-to-face because of the anxiety and the angst that comes part and parcel with some students, that could be an opportunity for those students to lower their affective filter. When we're in students' homes, when we're seeing where they are, we might be able to connect that out-of-school learning to in-school learning and make it more authentic in nature. When we're seeing where students are and we're thinking about how it is they learn with technology or what they do with technology outside of school and bring that into our instruction, that certainly can help. And as Karen said earlier, that engagement with parents and families. If parents are participating in the instruction, you're getting to know them, they're understanding maybe how you teach and some of the things that you're expecting of their children so that they can reinforce that at home. So for us though, we think the biggest opportunity with this distance learning era is in assessment. And I know that Elevation is really committed to this idea of equitable assessment practices, and we would be remiss if we did not address this today. I think this is a really great opportunity for us to rethink assessment, to shift from standardized assessments that everybody takes because everybody was in this, basic cookie cutter instructional format, right? And we don't have that anymore. So really it isn't fair to give students these standardized assessments. Rather, we can still go with standards-based assessments that reflect the actual instruction, which is varied within and across context. So let's keep our assessment standards based, but let's make sure that they're locally developed and that teachers who are actually doing the planning and instruction have a voice in creating those assessments. We're borrowing this idea from Margot Gottlieb, the idea of assessment for, as, and of learning. We really strongly believe that integrated performance assessments are really going to get at where students are in terms of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. We know that our students are very valuable data sources. And when we use these three different modes of communication, teachers can gather data from different sources and then provide that meaningful feedback. And the idea of assessment of learning, that teachers that can develop summative assessments, locally developed and that aren't developed by other people. That is a shift that would be great to see. And along with that, rather than our paper and pencil types of assessments, because as Karen said, a challenge is the assessment integrity, right? Rather, let's go with authentic and performance-based assessments. And I'd like to just kind of end this idea with a quote from Margot Gottlieb's book, Bridges to Educational Equity. I'm misquoting it right now, but in the book she says, assessment must be inclusive, fair, relevant, comprehensive, valid, and yield meaningful information for multiple stakeholders. Teachers must understand the power of assessment data in helping provide evidence that students are growing, learning, and making academic progress. And we really believe that this is one of those unique opportunities that our distance learning is providing us in terms of assessment.
And let me just add to kind of connect with what we talked about earlier. If we don't do this, then that deficit-based view of students is the only thing that people will see. So we have to find assessment practices that highlight our students' strengths. And that's never really going to be standardized testing for English learners.
So this comes to the end of our presentation. We have a few minutes for some questions. On the next slide, I'm actually going to put it here in the chat. Oops, sorry. I want to I just totally messed up here in the chat.
Here, go back to, I can share it in the chat if you go back to present.
I got it. I'm going to go back to present. Okay. So there is the document we created, and I'm going to turn it over to Maya and Ben and Teddy.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Some great engagement in the chat and some great questions coming through. There are a couple in the Q&A. So we'll start there. From Rebecca Richardson, she asked, how do we provide early literacy in math schools to older students when the high school does not provide a space for this type of instruction?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
How do we provide early literacy in math schools to older students when the high school does not provide a space for this type of instruction? Rebecca, I don't know if you want to raise your hand and clarify that question, but it sounds like there's not a space for the type of instruction that you were referring to in your presentation. And Rebecca and a couple of others actually wanted to know, how do you provide support to your students in this way when there's no advocacy for it at the school, or if things weren't set up in that way from a distance learning perspective, and there's no accountability from the schools?
So I think it's all very contextualized. It's depending on what state you're in and what the setup of your programming looks like. In our local, we're in New York State, and for New York State, when students come into our schools with zero English and they're 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 years old, we have pretty rigorous tests, the New York State Regents exams that they have to pass in order to graduate. So this is a question that teachers are always asking: how can I get an entering level student to pass a Regents exam in 2 years? And the basic, it's really hard to do that. So we have to, I think, start where the students are at. And we talk a lot with our graduate students about modifications, getting the materials from the content area teachers and using that content, but reducing, bringing down that linguistic demand so that students can access the content. They can get to the math, the science, the social studies, but their English proficiency level is not going to get in the way. Sometimes that means using their home language, finding translations. I think that's the real key, is that teachers need to modify that content to be able to match it to where the students are at. Otherwise, they're just going to shut down and they're not going to participate.
Great, thank you. One more question before we kind of wrap things up. What's your advice on making sure assessment for remote students are authentic in terms of synchronous learning? It's not fair when students in person are working hard and showing their own work and remote students are getting help at home.
Sorry. I'm sorry.
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Sure. So I think the question that for us is asking is basically, when you have two different environments and you have like a hybrid model, for example, you have some students that are working hard in the classroom and are taking those assessments in the classroom. So they're taking that assessment independently, whereas students who are at home and are in a remote setting may have some help or support from others at home that kind of disrupts the fairness of that assessment. So how do you kind of navigate that?
I think that performance assessments are really going to be what get students to really be able to show what it is that they know and what they're able to do. Certainly if we're just giving students at home the same paper and pencil test that the in-class students are taking as they're being proctored, certainly that's, there is an inequity there. But when we design some type of a performance task where students have to, complete some type of task that isn't just filling in answers, I think that's one solution. Karen?
Yeah, I think as Gretchen talked about the integrated performance assessment, if you're not really familiar with what that is, it's the idea of you're taking these three modes of communication, and you are putting them together as an assessment. So students begin with interpretation. They read or listen or view something, and they interpret it. So each person's interpretation is going to be unique. It's not going to be a multiple choice answer. It's going to be your personal answer. How do you respond to what you just saw? What meaning does that have for you? And then the second piece is interpersonal. Have a conversation with a partner about what you read or viewed or heard. And the third piece is prepare something, present something to us, present slides, present an essay, present a picture, present a storyboard, whatever, but it's unique to you. You have prepared it, and it shows your unique ideas, your strengths, your weaknesses, so that that way it's got some integrity to it. When we're using just multiple choice, it really is very easy for students to cheat online. So that, I mean, we just have to face facts. We have to know that and then work our way around it. So what Gretchen just put up is what we shared in that Google Doc in the chat. And we just took the online, the online tools that we mentioned in this presentation, and we categorized them into the interpretive communication supports, the interpersonal communication tech supports, and the presentational communication tech supports. And what we are encouraging you to do is, as you come in contact with new technologies, if you go to a professional development workshop or you read something online, try to think of which category it fits in so that you can use it in a more purposeful way. So instead of just having all these floating technologies out there, you can put it in its place and think about, how can I now use this strategically to get to the goal that I want to meet?
The other thing we'd like to share are some references. I was looking through the chat, that's why I jumped ahead to the next slide. But these are some of the resources that we've referenced in the presentation. And I'm going to share out this PDF with Maya to share out with all of the participants. But these are some of the books and articles that we referenced. And then certainly when we're talking about theory, these are the second language acquisition theorists that we referenced as well.
Wonderful. Well, any questions that come through, we can certainly share with you so that, you know, if we can get a response when we send out those recordings, that sounds great. But we'll pause there. I want to thank you both so much. Karen, Gretchen, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for the opportunity to learn from you. I think that was a wonderful session, and you did provide a lot of great resources for teachers, for educators to use in the classroom, online, certainly in hybrid settings everywhere. So great engagement in the chat, great questions, and great tools to move through this really strange new time that we're in. So really appreciate all that you put together and shared with us today.
Thank you so much thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Great
Thank
job.
you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.